Thank you. All right. Wow. There's always a wow when you turn around and see the audience. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So I'm Natalie Dykstra, and I'm the author of the recent book, Chasing Beauty, The Life of Isabella Stewart Gardner, that was published in March of 2024. And I can tell you more about myself after I give my talk, if you'd like. So I'm so delighted to be with you this morning. As Father Ian said, he and I started talking about the possibilities of the Colloquium on a warm summer day in July. Remember that? Yeah. And here we are, gathered on a frozen February morning, a very different season. So we're so glad you have braved the cold. Thank you so much for coming. I want to thank everyone at the Church of the Advent for hosting us, especially Father Ian and Father Alistair, and also Gretchen Manning, who took care of all the details. And I'm so delighted to be here with my fellow presenters. Thank you so much for your opening address, and also to Brother James and Diana. It's a thrill to be here with you. Diana is curator of the collection at the museum. A big thank you also to my husband, Mike Bundy, who's here, and our friends, Tim and Annie, and other wonderful friends, and Shana McKenna, who is head archivist at the Gardner Museum, and my brilliant editor, Deanne Ermey, without whom there would be no Chasing Beauty. So thank you so much, Deanne, for being here. It's so wonderful to see everyone together in one room. We have so much to explore today about Isabella Stewart Gardner's spiritual world, and really it's her spiritual worlds, because they were multiple. Isabella lived a very large life, one filled with terrible sorrow, but also great triumph. Born in 1840, 20 years before the Civil War, she lived long enough to see airplanes racing across the sky, and she loved watching them. She's most known for her eponymous museum, which she built from the ground up on the Fenway, the large Venetian-style palace called Fenway Court in the years before her death in 1924. She filled its many galleries with her vast collection of art, and in doing so, revealed something of her own heart. Her letter to the world, Emily Dickinson's lovely phrase, is not made up of words, but stone and fabric, flower and paint, object and sound. Fenway Court rang with another of Isabella's abiding passions, music. This fresco, simply entitled Musicians, and which can be seen on the museum's second floor stairway, is by the 16th century artist and biographer Giorgio Vasari. Jack Gardner, whom Isabella had married in 1860, purchased the fresco in Naples in 1897, knowing very well his wife's love of music and of performance. The drama of Beethoven and Brahms, the romance of Chopin and Saint-Saëns. The Boston Symphony Orchestra played at the opening of Fenway Court in 1903, and she hosted innumerable concerts, often performed by young American musicians to give emerging talent an audience. Isn't that a wonderful musical program? She enjoyed attending church services partly for the music. First as a young girl at Grace Church in New York, and then in Boston at Emmanuel Church, and then here at Church of the Advent. And we're going to hear some of the music she cherished at the Evensong service later today. I have to say how much she would have loved this. Chasing Beauty, my biography of Isabella, was published 2 years ago next month, which seems impossible. I've had the great fortune of telling her story to many groups, large and small, at libraries and bookstores, colleges and museums, at Grace Church, and now here at Advent. I've been so moved by responses from readers. Sometimes someone will tell me they are descended from a figure in the book, or that the museum was a place that sustained them after a death in the family, or that they felt inspired by Isabella's love of beauty. Often they mention her optimism, how her story has powerful moments of faith and hopefulness. Isabella's hopefulness was neither false nor some sort of mask. Rather, it had been hard-won and forged by awful sorrow. She was the oldest of 4 children, and all her siblings had died by the early 1880s. She buried her only child, a blue-eyed boy named Jackie, when he was not yet 2 years old, and just before her 25th birthday. She and Jack would have no more children. These painful losses were sometimes derailing, but what her museum conveys to us is something else. She is always pointing us to the light, most spectacularly in her magnificent courtyard, of course, but in many other ways as well. A hard-to-answer question hovers in my mind. What is the role of art in a time such as this one? Sometimes I'm not sure, but what I do know is art and creativity and the search for beauty are ancient, deeply and enduringly important, nourishing us like food and sunshine. And I know Isabella thought likewise, because her museum remains a lasting and eloquent testament to that belief. Isabella's religious faith is the theme for today. It was long-standing, braided like a bright strand together with her hope and an omnivorous curiosity about other people and other ways of believing. And all of this began as a young girl growing up in New York City. For me, an early and key discovery about her childhood was the Stewart family connection to Grace Church, at the time the grandest of the Episcopal churches in Lower Manhattan. After attending a Sunday service there, I scribbled impressions in my notebook, and here's part of what I wrote that morning in 2017. What strikes me almost to tears while listening to the organ music fill those arched spaces is imagining little Belle in those pews. She was tiny for her age, but athletic, alert, alive. One aspect of the Gardner Museum that's hard to put one's finger on is its religiosity. No, that's not quite the right word. Spirituality is a better word. Belle was more devout, more pious than what has been known. And there's a direct but little-known line between Grace Church in New York and her museum in Boston. So now I'm going to read a scene from the end of chapter 1, A New York Girl, 1840 to 1855, to give a clearer sense of these early formative years. At the bend of Broadway and 10th Street, 3 blocks north of the Stewart home, the wooden steeple of Grace Church rose high above other buildings and treetops, visible from almost any angle in the city. The French Gothic Revival Sanctuary had been finished in 1846, and its architect, the 24-year-old prodigy James Renwick, who went on to build St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, had not been to Europe. So he studied every book on church architecture the congregation leaders could find. When the Stewarts joined, and when little Belle and her siblings attended, the sanctuary windows were a mix of clear and pastel-colored glass. The floor under the elevated pews was wood planking, and the walls and arches were made of Sing Sing marble, so called because it had been cut by inmates at a prison north of the city. David Stewart, and here's a photograph of him with his son, also David, Belle's younger brother. David Stewart, who would serve as a trustee, bought a pew as a founding member for $650. In its fast-evolving neighborhood, Grace Church, a part of the Episcopal Diocese of New York, became one of the city's most fashionable congregations in the years before the Civil War. Surnames engraved on small brass plaques attached to pews were a who's who of antebellum New York. Astor, Rhinelander, Aspinwall, Stuyvesant, Edith Newbald Jones, later Wharton, was christened in the church. The services were sometimes so packed that people would stand in the aisles or outside the windows to hear the preacher and the hymns. The pageantry of Grace Church, a potent and exclusive joining of sacred music, belief, and beauty, could be electrifying. It left a very strong impression on Belle. On April 2nd, 1854, less than 2 weeks before Belle's April birthday, her sister, Adelia Stewart, died of a fever. She was 12 years old. There are no images of Adelia, no books with her name inscribed on a page, no letters or handiwork. In the midst of life, we are in death was the opening line to a prayer Belle would have known well from her church's Book of Common Prayer. The stark reminder appeared too in sermons and stitched samplers, sudden loss, the kind that the Stewarts experienced. Here's a wonderful 2 portraits of her parents, David and Adelia Stewart. The sudden loss, the kind that the Stewarts experienced, shakes foundations as it must have done for Belle those spring days of her 14th year, with her parents in disarray from grief and worry and the burning question, why her and who's next? Belle's parents recorded their losses in light and color, commissioning a set of stained glass windows by the British Pre-Raphaelite artist Henry Holliday for Grace Church's sanctuary. Installed in 1883, when Belle was traveling through Asia, the windows are known as the Raising of Lazarus. They remain today in memory of Adelia and also of Belle's brothers, David Jr., who died of brain cancer in 1874, and James, who died in 1881 at the Stewart home at the age of 22. Belle would see her mother and father when visiting in New York until their deaths in 1886 and 1891. Presumably, she attended Grace Church when in the city, but she made no record of the windows, nor of the siblings' death they commemorated. Even so, a line moves from Grace Church to Belle's future museum in Boston. In constructing Fenway Court all those years later, she testified to her vision of life through a circuitous return to a sacred space of her childhood, where relishing artistic splendor was a profound form of worship and remembrance. As innovative and sui generis as the museum was, it also followed a family path. Belle did as her parents had done, but on a much larger scale. She transformed overwhelming personal loss into art, into beauty. The Gardners were churchgoers. These are 2 wonderful photographs that are in the family papers in the private hands still, although I know the museum has copies of these as well. And these were taken in 1862. The Gardners were churchgoers. Even when Jack sometimes stayed home, which was on occasion, Isabella attended regularly. It was part of the week that meant a great deal to her, and she was an active member and gave generously. And we'll hear more about her generosity and philanthropy from Father Ian and Brother James today, and also Diana, I'm sure. Suffice it to say, even when she was traveling overseas, she would search for a Sunday service, whether it was in Venice or Paris or Cairo. Once in Jerusalem, she tended the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in the center of the Old City. This is her photograph of Jerusalem from Mount Olive in one of her travel albums. And this is what she says in her diary. Impossible to describe the church with its many chapels, gorgeous silver and gold lamps. The impression one receives, she wrote, is only to be felt, not spoken. Isabella's faith was neither sweet nor sentimental. She was too tough-minded for that. Once, when she had a chance to hear the revivalist Billy Sunday preach in Boston, she scoffed, telling a friend, "I don't like the curiosity idea mixed up with religion." Found in her papers is a line she had written down that may have served as a quiet creed. "Our faith," she wrote, "might cause our light to shine on some other heart, which as yet has no light of its own." She didn't seek to save souls, but rather to improve lives, reaching out toward others in the here and now. Morris Carter, her first biographer and first director of Fenway Court, once observed that, quote, her attitude, this is him saying it, attitude towards religion was striking evidence of her level-headedness. She believed in religion with a capital R, and she knew it made little difference which. Interesting, complex. In other words, she had a strong interest in other faiths, and openness especially evident when traveling overseas. And in the spring of 1883, she and Jack embarked on a year-long tour through Asia. They traveled to innumerable countries and cities: Tokyo, Kyoto, Beijing, Hong Kong, Saigon, Singapore, Rangoon, Delhi. The itinerary is very long. They spent 3 glorious days at Cambodia's Angkor Wat, the ancient ruins of the Khmer Empire and the largest religious complex in the world. She kept notes of these travels and carefully pasted photographs into 6 large albums, many with images of temples, shrines, and gods. These are 2 wonderful Buddhas, one from Kamakura and one near Kyoto, the second one. I want to read a brief scene, and it is much briefer than the previous excerpt, from her travels in Japan that describes her response to holy places not of her own faith. The scene takes place in late summer 1883, a few days after arriving in Kyoto. They've settled into their hotel set above a thick stand of very old cherry trees, and they've spent their days looking and shopping. They also toured the sites, a silk factory, a girls' school, and the city's numerous Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines. They visited the lush gardens of the 17th century emperor with its famous tea houses. At Nara, Belle and Jack stood before the great Buddha, marveling at its massive size and impassive expression. For a small sum, they were allowed to ring the enormous bell. Isabella reacted strongly when she visited places expressing a faith not her own, something that had happened on her travels through Egypt a decade before. "How beautiful are their Buddhist temples," she exclaimed to a friend, adding that when she entered one, quote, "I never want to come away. I could lie on the mats and look forever through the dim light." Unlike other Western travelers, she had no impulse to contribute to proselytizing. Instead, she found this kind of immersion freeing and intensely moving. She listened for the bells and chants of the Buddhist priests in nearby temples while reading or writing letters on the veranda of the hotel where she and Jack stayed. She carefully noted in her letters and journals how the different religions were practiced. She was not alone, of course, in her attraction to Buddhism. Ernest Fenollosa would convert to Buddhism, as would William Sturgis Bigelow. For Belle, the temples and shrines awakened her eye, not so much to profess a belief or faith, but to feel more deeply through aesthetic experience. Beauty of all kinds, in nature and human-made, had a direct path to her heart and imagination. Beauty felt healing and expanding. Isabella's interest in Buddhism would continue strengthening after she became close friends with the curator and writer Akakura, who joined Boston's MFA in 1904 as its first curator of Asian art. And together they would talk of spiritual things, and he would write poems for her. One ending with these lines: "Rush on forever through river of heaven, in the restless search of infinity, Aum to the eternal light of sadness, Aum to the darkness of love. Here were the spiritual contradictions of life, how sadness held light and how love could be made of darkness. The most common motif in Fenway Court is a religious one, that of Virgin and Child. Isabella's first purchase of an old master painting was the Virgin of Mercy by the 17th century Francisco Zuberon, a work now known to be from his workshop. The large painting hangs in the small Spanish chapel at one end of the first floor Spanish cloister. It makes a striking visual rhyme with the photograph of Isabella holding Jackie. There are many portraits and depictions of the Madonna and Child in her collection, of course. The first is a 15th century, on this slide on your left, is a 15th century tempera on wood by an unnamed Italian artist. And on the right is Pesolino's wonderful Virgin and Child with a swallow. I love Jesus's very muscular arm. The wit of that painting, I love that wit in there. Two sculptures of many in her collection. The first is by a 19th century imitator of an Italian sculptor, Rossellini. It's in the Long Gallery as you first come in. And the second is from the 14th century France on the first floor. There are also nativities, this one by Libera di Verona. I love that one so much. Innumerable biblical scenes. De Amelia's great, The Annunciation. And on the right is Giotto's masterpiece, the presentation of the Christ child in the temple. Look how the figures of Mary and the Christ child reach for each other across that golden space. There are clerical vestments, crosses, and depictions of crucifixion. This is Jesus on the way to the crucifixion. This hushed one is by the Circle of Giovanni Bellini and was one of Isabella's favorites. And this, from 12th century Catalonia, hangs in the third floor hallway and is the last work of art a visitor sees after leaving the Gothic room. It's also one of Isabella's last large acquisitions, purchased in July of 1917, just after America entered World War I. Its spare, angular form, made of wood now scarred by time, becomes a quiet coda. Love's triumph over pain, that's one of the stories the museum tells. There's a journey one makes at Fenway Court, from the exuberant celebration of earthly life on the first floor with the Farnese sarcophagus in the blooming courtyard, up the staircase to galleries that display the enormous power of queens and kings and popes, to the Titian room, its walls covered with luxurious red textiles named after the painting by the Italian Renaissance master that was one of Isabella's greatest prizes. From this triumphant moment, a turn into the long gallery with its Bardini blue walls presents images of ultimate sacrifice and pain. Botticelli's Madonna cradles the boy she will one day die. Giovanni della Robbia's lamentation over the dead Christ, sorrow sealed in Mary's face, and a final turn to the glorious colors of the medieval French stained glass window at the end of the narrow corridor in the small chapel. This is what mattered to her. As one ascends the steps of the museum, one ascends in temporal power. But then a turn is made near the end to the spiritual and to everything that can never be contained in a museum. Those who know Isabella in her later years all commented on her vigor and love of life. Henry Adams remembered her as the youngest of his cohort by far. People recalled how she spoke with a low voice and listened with great intensity. One observer said she moved across a room like a ship in full sail. Another wrote to her saying, "I love to chatter with you," and then asked, "However can you sit so straight?" In 1919, Isabella suffered a debilitating stroke that paralyzed her right side. This is John Singer Sargent's remarkable last portrait of her, made on a visit to Fenway Court on a warm September morning in 1922. That same year, she wrote to a friend in Central Africa, instructing him not to worry about her. "I am quite an invalid," she wrote, "but cheerful to the last degree. I think my mind is all right, and I live on it. I keep up a lot of thinking, and I'm really very much alive." By 1923, Isabella sent word to the Brothers of the Society of St. John the Evangelist that she was now near death and wanted communion as soon as possible. The brothers were dear to her. Years before, they had taught her to pray. Then she rallied. She prepared for the future of her museum, ensuring that it would survive her for the education and enjoyment of the public forever. Those were her words. Several more seasons passed. In the late evening of July 17, 1924, Isabella died in her sleep at the age of 84. At her funeral service at Church of the Advent, a choir of 50 and a church full of mourners sang many of her favorite hymns, including the great Scottish Anglican hymn, "Abide with Me," with its haunting opening line, "Abide with me, fast falls the eventide, the darkness deepens, Lord, with me abide." She requested in her will that the museum's name be changed to her name. And every year on her birthday, April 14, the Brothers of the Society gather in the museum's third-floor chapel to celebrate a Mass, a memorial service. We'll talk more about that service. A promise made in friendship that the brothers keep to this day. She was buried at the Gardner family mausoleum at Mount Auburn Cemetery, laid to rest between her husband Jack and her little boy Jackie. The remarkable story of Isabella Stewart Gardner follows an arc from a season of many losses early in her life to this woman, decades later, on the balcony of the Palazzo Barbaro on Venice's Grand Canal with fireworks flaring in the distance. The painter Anders Zorn portrays her friend in motion with her arms flung wide, open to the world and experience and stepping toward us. She was reported to have said that evening, "Come out, all of you. This is too beautiful to miss." She would chase beauty her whole life. And as she did so, she was chasing transcendence. Following a spiritual impulse she learned first at Grace Church. Recently, I had a chance to revisit the remarkable archives at the Gardner Museum. I was looking through her private papers again and came across this Welsh prayer copied out in her distinctive handwriting. It made me shake a little, and I'd like to close with its beautiful lines. "Grant, O Lord, thy protection, and in thy protection, strength, and in strength, understanding, and in understanding, knowledge, and in knowledge, the knowledge of justice, and in the knowledge of justice, the love of it, and in that love, the love of all existences, and in the knowledge and love of all existences, the love of God, God and every good."